March 14, 1989, 6 a.m. General Michel Aoun stands on the balcony of the presidential palace in Bayabda, looking out over a Beirut divided by 15 years of war. In a few hours, he will make the most consequential decision in modern Lebanese history. At 10 a.m., Aoun steps before the microphones of Voice of Lebanon radio. His voice is steady, defiant. As of this moment, I declare a war of liberation against the Syrian occupation of Lebanon. We will drive out the occupiers, even if we must raze Beirut to the ground. 25 kilometers away in Damascus, Hafez al-Assad receives the news with cold fury. The Lebanese general has just declared war on a regional superpower. Assad picks up his phone and gives a simple order: destroy him. What followed was the most devastating bombardment in Beirut's history. Syrian artillery would rain down on Christian neighborhoods for 6 months. Entire apartment blocks would collapse. Families would huddle in basements as their world exploded above them. This was Lebanon's last stand, one general's desperate gamble to save his country's independence. It would end with René Moawad elected president and assassinated 17 days later. The dream of a free Lebanon was dying, one shell at a time. Michel Aoun was never supposed to be president. A soldier's soldier, he had spent his career in Lebanon's fractured army, watching politicians tear his country apart while foreign powers carved up its territory. Born in 1935 to a middle-class Maronite family in Haret Haik, ironically, what would later become Hezbollah's stronghold, Aoun joined the military academy Shey in 1958. He was shaped by Fuad Chehab, the general president who had briefly unified Lebanon after the First Civil War. But Aoun was different from the sectarian warlords who dominated Christian politics. While Bashir Gemayel built his power through militia violence and Samir Geagea consolidated Christian areas through elimination campaigns, Aoun remained within the national army. He believed Lebanon could only survive as a unified sovereign state, not as a collection of sectarian fiefdoms. In September 1988, as President Amin Gemayel's term expired with no successor elected, the dying president made a fateful choice. Rather than hand power to the Syrian-backed government in West Beirut, Gemayel appointed Aoun as interim military ruler. It was constitutionally dubious. Prime ministers were supposed to be Sunni, not Maronite. But Aoun commanded the loyalty of what remained of the Lebanese army's Christian units. More importantly, he commanded something that had been missing from Lebanese politics for 15 years: genuine popular support. Crowds gathered outside the Bayabda palace chanting, "Aoun, Aoun." Here, finally, was someone who spoke of Lebanon as a nation, rather than a sectarian bargaining chip. Here was someone willing to say what many Lebanese had whispered for years: that Syria was not a brother nation bringing peace, but an occupying army that had to go. Lebanon now had 2 governments claiming legitimacy. In East Beirut, General Aoun ruled from the presidential palace with the backing of Christian parliamentarians and army units. In West Beirut, Sunni Prime Minister Selim al-Hos governed with Syrian support and the loyalty of Muslim MPs. The division wasn't just political, it was geographic, economic, and existential. Aoun controlled the port of Beirut, Lebanon's economic lifeline. Al-Hos controlled the airport and the central bank. Each government printed its own currency, issued its own stamps, collected its own taxes. But Syria held the real power. 35,000 Syrian troops occupied 2/3 of Lebanon, from the Bekaa Valley to West Beirut's southern suburbs. They weren't peacekeepers anymore. Assad had dropped that pretense. They were an occupying army, with Lebanese politicians serving as colonial administrators. This infuriated Aoun. "We have been treated like children," he declared in one broadcast. "Syria decides who can be president, who can be prime minister, who lives and who dies. This is not independence, this is slavery with a Lebanese flag." The Arab League tried to mediate, proposing yet another reconciliation conference. Aoun's response was blunt: "We will not negotiate our independence. We will not bargain away our sovereignty. The Syrians must leave, all of them, completely, immediately." It was the kind of uncompromising stance that had been missing from Lebanese politics for 15 years, but it was also a declaration of war against the region's most ruthless regime. Aoun's first move wasn't military, it was economic. On March 6, 1989, he declared a blockade of all illegal ports controlled by Syrian-backed militias. Every ship entering Lebanese waters would have to dock at Beirut port under government control. The message was clear. Lebanon had one legitimate government, one legal authority, one national sovereignty. The days of warlords and foreign occupiers carving up the country were over. Syria's response was swift and brutal. On March 8th, Syrian artillery positions in the mountains opened fire on Beirut port. Shells crashed into the docks, setting warehouses ablaze. The message was equally clear. Assad would not tolerate defiance. But Aoun escalated further. On March 14th, exactly 7 years after Israel's withdrawal from most of Lebanon, he made his historic declaration. Today, I announce a war of liberation. We call on all Lebanese to resist the Syrian occupation by every means possible. The Syrian bombardment began immediately. From positions in the Metin Mountains, Syrian 155mm howitzers rained death on Christian neighborhoods. The shells fell randomly, on apartment buildings, schools, hospitals, churches. There was no military logic to it. This was collective punishment designed to break the will of anyone who dared support Aoun. Families fled East Beirut by the thousands, carrying their belongings in plastic bags. Those who stayed huddled in basements and underground shelters. The green line that had divided Muslim and Christian Beirut became a front line again, with Syrian tanks positioned just meters from Lebanese army checkpoints. International airlines refused to fly into Beirut. Insurance companies cancelled policies. The Lebanese pound collapsed. Assad was slowly strangling what remained of the Lebanese state. As Beirut burned, Arab leaders watched in horror. The Lebanese civil war was supposed to be over, or at least contained. Instead, it was threatening to drag the entire region into conflict. King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, King Hassan II of Morocco, and President Chadli Ben-Jedid of Algeria formed a tripartite committee to resolve the crisis. Their message to the Lebanese was simple. Come to Taif, and we'll help you find peace. In September 1989, 62 surviving Lebanese parliamentarians, nearly half of the original 128, gathered in the Saudi resort town of Taif. They hadn't met as a body since 1984. Many hadn't seen each other in years. The negotiations were grueling. Saudi Foreign Minister Saud al-Faisal shuttled between delegations, carrying proposals and counter-proposals. The Syrian delegation, because of course Assad had representatives there, insisted that any agreement legitimize their continued presence in Lebanon. The final document was a masterpiece of diplomatic compromise and Lebanese surrender. The Taif Agreement, signed on October 22, 1989, promised constitutional reforms that would reduce Maronite political dominance. Parliament would be split 50-50 between Christians and Muslims. The president would lose most executive powers to the prime minister and cabinet, but the price was Lebanon's independence. Syria's occupation was legalized under the euphemism of special relationship. Syrian forces would redeploy to the Bekaa Valley, eventually. Assad's veto over Lebanese politics was written into the constitution. Aoun's supporters called it the capitulation of Taif. The general himself denounced it as Syrian colonialism dressed up in legal language. But 58 parliamentarians voted yes. They were exhausted by war, terrified of Assad's artillery, and desperate for any peace that would let them return to their homes. On October 24th, they elected René Moawad as Lebanon's new president. He was a moderate Maronite from Zgharta, acceptable to Syria but untainted by the civil war. Finally, it seemed, Lebanon might have peace. René Moawad's presidency began with hope. On November 5, 1989, he flew from Damascus to Beirut, the first Lebanese president in years to travel freely between the two capitals. Crowds lined the route from the airport, waving Lebanese flags and chanting for peace. Moawad was everything Aoun was not. A career politician, a diplomatic moderate, a man who believed in compromise over confrontation. At 64, he had survived 15 years of civil war by building bridges rather than burning them. His inaugural address was conciliatory. "The time for war is over," he declared from the Parliament building in West Beirut. "The time for reconstruction has begun. We must heal our wounds and rebuild our nation. All of us, Christians and Muslims together." But Michel Aoun was not ready to surrender. From the presidential palace in Beabda, he rejected Moawad's legitimacy. "This man is a Syrian puppet," Aoun broadcast on Voice of Lebanon radio. "He was not elected by free parliamentarians, but by hostages in Damascus." The country now had two presidents claiming authority. Aoun controlled the palace, the army, and the Christian heartland. Moawad controlled parliament, the government ministries, and Syrian backing. It was an impossible situation. International mediators scrambled to find a solution. U.S. envoys shuttled between East and West Beirut. The Vatican sent emissaries. Even Hafez al-Assad's son Basil, being groomed as heir to the Syrian presidency, personally met with Christian leaders to find a compromise. The breakthrough seemed to come on November the 20th. French diplomats reported that Aoun was ready to negotiate a face-saving exit from the palace. A joint ceremony would be held at the American University of Beirut, with both men pledging to work together for Lebanese unity. It never happened. November 22, 1989, 4:17 p.m. President René Moawad's black Mercedes motorcade winds through West Beirut after attending Lebanese Independence Day ceremonies. As the convoy passes through the Kantari district, a parked Peugeot sedan explodes. The blast is enormous. Investigators later estimate 250 kilograms of TNT. Moawad's armored car is lifted into the air and thrown 50 meters. The president dies instantly, along with 23 others, including his bodyguards and several passers-by. René Moawad had been president of Lebanon for exactly 17 days. The assassination of René Moawad shattered any hope of peaceful transition. On November 24th, Syrian-controlled parliamentarians elected Elias Hraoui as the new president. Unlike Moawad, Hraoui had no interest in compromise with Aoun. The new president's first act was to dismiss Aoun's government and order him to vacate the presidential palace. Aoun's response was defiant. "I am the legitimate president of Lebanon. This Syrian puppet has no authority over me." But Aoun's position was crumbling. The artillery war had devastated East Beirut's economy. Hundreds of thousands of Christians had fled the country entirely. Those who remained were exhausted by months of bombardment and siege. Worse, Aoun was now fighting a war on two fronts. In January 1990, his forces clashed with Samir Geaghea's Lebanese Forces militia. The intra-Christian war that had ravaged the community for 5 years exploded again, with Syrian shells falling on both sides. The end came on October 13, 1990. Syrian forces launched their final assault on the Christian enclave. Tanks rolled through Beirut's streets while jets screamed overhead, bombing the presidential palace. Aoun made his last radio broadcast from the palace basement as explosions shook the building above. "We have fought for Lebanon's freedom. We have sacrificed everything for our country's independence. History will judge whether we were right." At 2 p.m., with Syrian soldiers at the palace gates, Aoun walked to the French embassy and requested asylum. The war of liberation was over. Syria had won. The Lebanese civil war was finally ending, not with victory for any Lebanese faction, but with the complete subordination of Lebanon to Syrian rule. Michel Aoun's war of liberation failed, but it was not meaningless. For 6 months, one general and his followers had reminded the world that Lebanon was supposed to be an independent nation, not a Syrian province. The price was enormous. Thousands died in the artillery war. East Beirut was reduced to rubble. An entire generation of Lebanese Christians fled their homeland, never to return, but Aoun had planted a seed. 15 years later, after Syria's intelligence chief was assassinated in Beirut, massive crowds would gather in Martyrs Square demanding Syrian withdrawal. They called it the Cedar Revolution. But it was really the fulfillment of Aoun's dream. In 2005, Syrian forces finally left Lebanon. Michel Aoun returned from exile in Paris to a hero's welcome. 11 years later, at age 81, he was elected president of Lebanon, the office he had claimed by right but never held by law. The last stand in Beabda Palace was over, but Lebanon's struggle for true independence continued.